It's a real pleasure to be here. What a gorgeous morning. And what I'd like to do is kind of share here for about 45 minutes a little bit of where things have gone for me, my own discovery, because as you can imagine, things, I've been on a vertical part of the learning curve. And since the book Proof of Heaven came out in 2012, of course, there's been tremendous progress in my own kind of understanding of the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality. There was a second book that we wrote in follow-up to that called The Map of Heaven that I think most people have still not encountered. And yet, right now, Karen Newell and I are working on a third book that we hope to really kind of bring a lot of this together, because in many ways, those two books were only kind of the beginning of where things are headed here. And what I came to realize in this whole effort is that, and of course this is really true for all of us, so it's not like this is some great revelation, but I came to realize that a lot of what I was going through in terms of my personal journey of understanding is being mirrored by what humanity is going through over at least the last 4,000 years or so of human development, of civilization, evolution, and understanding about the nature of reality. And I think it's important to point out, to kind of set the context, that in that great swath of development and of understanding, the 400 years of the rise, the scientific revolution, seeking natural laws to try and understand the workings of the universe, I would say is really a turbulent adolescence. So we are not to look at the rise of scientific materialism as kind of the pathway towards the future, but it was kind of the kind of trying and the trials and tribulations of growing up. But to think that the materialist model is in any way going to satisfy our understanding of the nature of reality is false. And in fact, I would say that reigning paradigm of current scientific materialism, within the next decade, I would say, will go the path of such thinking as, oh, the earth is flat. Oh, the sun goes around the earth. Well, likewise, to think that the physical is all that there is, and that somehow the physical brain creates consciousness out of purely physical matter is going the same way. That is something that within scientific and philosophical circles is known as the hard problem of consciousness. I would say essentially that the hard problem really should be called the impossible problem of consciousness if you are a pure physicalist and think the only thing that exists is the physical world. Because there really is no way to try and put together a linkage of brain creating consciousness, because that's not how it works. So what this is really all about is going back to first principles. René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Well, he kind of had it right, but he in many ways led us down a wrong pathway there. And I would say that dualism, the idea that there is the brain and there's the mind, they seem to work in parallel, and yet no one seems to understand the exact relationship. That dualism is a stepping stone. It cannot possibly be the answer, because there's one truth, there's one nature of reality, and that is what I think we are here to try and discover. And the notion that human beings are made of this kind of a spiritual essence and of the material essence, and that they work in parallel, will not be the final answer. And this has a lot to do with a concept that Karen Newell and I will be expanding on in the book that we're working on now, which has to do with what we call the supreme illusion. And this is something that is worth pointing out. It's actually not even debatable. It's simply a fact, and yet most people don't really think about this fact, and it's because the brain and the mind do an incredibly magnificent job of fooling us into believing that what we witness in our experience all of the people in this room, and I see this beautiful casino that's been here for almost 200 years. And then at night I can go out and see the beauty of this lovely town in the valley, look up at the stars and galaxies, and witness every bit of that magnificent beauty of the world out there. But never forget what you are experiencing is an internal construct. You're only witnessing a model created within mind. And of course, the scientific revolution of the last 400 years has been built on the premise that we are here to understand that world around us, the physical workings of the natural world out there. And then, of course, 115 years ago, along came several European scientists mainly, but also some Americans later on, investigating the very strange qualities of that subatomic world that makes up this fabric of this reality around us. Atoms, molecules, subatomic particles, every bit of that. And thinking that we are here to witness that, like the scientist in the white coat with his clipboard taking notes, as if we're separate. And of course, therein lies a deep part of the confusion, is we are not separate. We are all one with the universe. We're one with each other. And in fact, I would say that any time that you separate out part of that world and isolate it to try and study it and understand it, you are introducing distortions and confusions. Now, I would say that one of my revelations about this early on after my coma story, I think I need to see a show of hands. How many have not read the book Proof of Heaven or heard me talk or anything? Okay, so a few, maybe about 10% of the audience. But so in that discovery, it has everything to do with understanding that we really are all one. And I remember after my coma, when I was deeply into this mystery of consciousness and trying to understand it, I read that beautiful book by Jill Bolte Taylor, My Stroke of Insight. And she was a Harvard neuroanatomist. She had a vascular malformation in her Wernicke's area, which is in the speech receptive area in the dominant temporal lobe. That's where our language puts together definitions and kind of the ideas of the way the world works. But of course, our language breaks it out into separate objects, breaks it out into things that interact with other things. And we look at them as separate because that's a simple way to do it with our kind of self-perceived limited human bandwidth. And yet, that introduces distortion. Now, the interesting thing about Jill Bolte Taylor's story is as her vascular malformation ruptured, this was back in 1996 that she had her hemorrhage, but it destroyed her Wernicke's area, it destroyed her linguistic definitions and boundaries and relationships. The interesting phenomenon that she witnessed when that happened was that she was sitting there with this evolving stroke, this hemorrhage, and her language center was being destroyed. Her boundaries itself expanded outward. She became one with the room, the rug, the desk, the chair, everything outside the window, with this incredibly overpowering sense of oneness and of love and of identity of all there is. And when I first read that several months after my coma, it helped me to start getting to some deeper understanding of what had happened when my own neocortex was destroyed by meningitis. Now, this was a much more global destruction than what Jill Bolte Taylor had, but I think her story is very instructive because it shows how powerful that kind of organizational set of principles of our rational, logical thinking mind with all of these defined objects and their interrelationships, how that can fool us into a false sense of separation. And in fact, I would say that's one of the most beautiful lessons of my entire journey, is coming to realize how we are all one with the universe. And the more we can transcend those false boundaries of separation, and those false boundaries come at us in very strong form in our conventional scientific approach to understanding. The conventional scientific wisdom of today can be generically called reductive materialism, which basically means the only thing that exists is the material world, And if we reduce it all down to the most fundamental elements, the subatomic particles that make up this world, then we can come to understand it in some way. Well, why in the world anyone would think that as you throw away all that information of the way the world is, to get down to those tiny little separate entities and try and understand them, why would you ever think that doing that would enable you to understand how this universe works? Because you've thrown away so much by just getting down to those fundamental particles and trying to understand their interactions. From my point of view, it makes much more sense to take a top-down approach. And of course, we think, well, wait a minute, the human brain and mind is very limited and has very narrow bandwidth. In fact, modern psychology would tell you that probably 90% of what you perceive moment to moment in this room is really just being filled in by your brain. It's not the sensory bandwidth that's filling in all that information. Your brain is kind of filling in what ought to be there based on prior experience. So it really is a whole different way of looking at the nature of reality. And it has everything to do with understanding consciousness. Now, to kind of get my journey, it's important to point out who I was before. And before my coma, which happened back in 2008. I had grown up the son of an academic neurosurgeon. My father was very influential in my life. He had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War. He was mainly in the Pacific Theater. And he had grown up in eastern Tennessee during the Depression. And his father was very influential in his life. His father was a general surgeon, had taken him to the Baptist church every Sunday of his young life. My father had a very strong belief in God. He knew the reality of God. He knew the power of prayer. He knew that when he operated on a patient, that patient did well, it was thanks to God's work, and that his part as a surgeon was only a tiny little part. And for him, there was never a conflict between the science that he studied. He was also the chairman of a neurosurgical training program back in the 60s and 70s. So he was deeply steeped in the world of science. And I remember he had great interest in physics, cosmology, chemistry. He understood all of it. But there was never a conflict. He knew that God was far, far beyond anything that scientific knowledge could ever weigh in on one way or the other. Now, turns out I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like many others of that generation, I always knew that science is the pathway to truth. I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. But I also realized that reductive materialism, that simplistic materialist science that I had come to worship over many decades of working as an academic neurosurgeon, including 15 years at Harvard Medical School, that science is kindergarten level. And in fact, all you need to do is find out a little bit more about consciousness, and you'll start to realize that impossible problem of consciousness, not just the hard problem. And it's impossible if you're trying to fit it all into a physicalist view of the universe. So then the question becomes, okay, René Descartes, I think therefore I am. If there is mind and there is matter, how do we get deeper into the way the universe really works? And I think to go there, it's important to point out that science that I worship, and I do not use that phrase lightly, because I would say that reductive materialism in our conventional science is a faith-based religion that has less to support it than some of the faith-based religions. And when I say that, what I really mean is the idea that the physical brain creates the illusion of consciousness. That's where we really have it all wrong. And that is something that I subscribed to before my coma. I thought, well, we just haven't done enough work. We need to study it harder. And sooner or later, when we understand enough about the brain, we will come to understand how the brain creates consciousness. Now, there are many in that field of kind of conventional science and philosophy who take it much further, like Daniel Dennett at Tufts, a philosopher who would very proudly tell you, none of us are conscious. We're all zombies. And what they're saying there, what the thinking is that the physical brain has subatomic particles that follow the natural laws of physics. And then, of course, the atoms and molecules follow the laws of chemistry. And if you assume that the whole thing is just one great big physical chemical system, then you can understand why they would say, well, of course, consciousness is an illusion. It's an epiphenomenon of the workings of all those subatomic particles following natural laws. But if you think that consciousness is real in that setting, or if you think that a human being has free will, forget it. There's absolutely no way that that can exist. The free will goes out the window because this illusion of consciousness is just those subatomic particles following natural laws. And it's nothing more than that. That's why it would be considered just an illusion of the physical workings of the brain. So they try and dismiss it completely. No such thing. They are being sucker punched by that supreme illusion. By the fact that they think that what they're witnessing out there is reality as it exists. And yet the beautiful gift of quantum mechanics is what it's been trying to tell us for 115 years, is that there is no reality out there independent of the mind, of consciousness, of the observer. And that in fact, consciousness is fundamental. That's a much better way to look at the data and try and make sense of the empirical environment in which we find ourselves. But the thing is, one then has to make that complete flip, which is something that I've been working on doing ever since my coma back in 2008. And that is realizing that the only thing any human being has ever witnessed is the inside of their own consciousness. And in kind of the parlance of quantum mechanics, the very notion that of all the cloud of possibilities, when you're looking at any subatomic interaction and measurement, that entire cloud of possibilities of where particles might be and how they might interact, that is all something that is subject to the observer. And it's by the observer witnessing the world that we call that what is called collapse of the wave function, even though, of course, when you get into quantum mechanics, what you realize is there are a tremendous number of kind of possible explanations for that measurement problem, for the act of observation, and how it crystallizes out a certain actuality. But what I came to realize is, given that all that I witness around this world is an internal construct in my own consciousness, every bit of it is a collapse of that wave function. Every bit of it. Now, then the question is, of course, is my reality like the reality of others? You know, how much can we say that our reality is a consensus reality? And I think part of this is realizing that as I see it, this is all about seeing consciousness as fundamental, first and foremost, that in fact, you know, people say, well, wait a minute, consciousness had to wait to evolve. Well, no, it didn't, not at all. And the way that the current scientific models would then look at that function of the brain is, instead of what's called the production model, which is the conventional idea that the physical brain creates consciousness out of purely physical matter, there's a whole group of ideas based around what can loosely be called the filter theory. The idea that the brain serves more like kind of a transceiver or filter, reducing valve, that actually limits primordial consciousness down to this minuscule trickle of our awareness. And it includes that illusion of the here and now. Because in fact, even time and space, mass and energy, are on this side of the veil. They're not some fundamental part of reality independent of consciousness. That's what quantum mechanics has been trying to tell us. And so this is a much more facile way of handling the data. But it also means we're no longer swimming with our little water wings in the shallow end of the pool, in the simplistic kindergarten level falsehoods of materialism and reductive materialism. But we've now gone into a region where we start to admit that the universe is fundamentally spiritual, that in fact we are all spiritual beings, and that in fact that is all part of one consciousness, one mind. And this is where I think things are headed. Now, of course, may be challenging to those who are seduced by the simplicity of reductive materialism, because they feel pretty comfortable, even to the point of, hey, got a theory of everything. Luckily, Stephen Hawking wrote an article back in Scientific American in September 2010, where he said, well, hold on, folks, let's not get too excited. We might have to settle, at least for now, for several theories of everything. Okay. Well, I guess that shows you how far we are from actually having a theory of everything. There is one truth. There is one master understanding, and that is something that we can approach. But I also saw from my journey that human brain and mind will never completely understand even the nature of consciousness and how it manifests to us. But that doesn't mean we can't come to a far greater understanding of it. And the way to do that is by going within. And that is something that we will share much more about. I'll kind of finish talking about that, and also this afternoon, Karen Newell will be leading a sound meditation. And this is one using differential sound frequencies to help people get into deep meditative states. And as I go along in this discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I revisit those realms of my NDE on a frequent basis by going deep within. And it's astonishing that you can use something as simple as sound, and specifically using slight differences in the frequency presented to the two ears, to actually free up your conscious awareness. And in effect, do what happened to me back in November of 2008, which is to take your brain out of the equation. And that's where consciousness really runs free. As you realize that we're conscious in spite of our brain, really. That's where one starts realizing that going deep within consciousness is facilitated by getting the brain out of the way. And I believe that the filtering mechanism is very strongly part of our neocortex. And of course, that's what, before my coma, I would have told you is the prime engine, the most powerful calculator in the human brain, the neocortex. It's the part that makes us all human. And I would have said that that is what generates that consciousness. Of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, that's not the right way to look at it. It doesn't produce consciousness at all. And for those out there in the neuroscientific world who say, well, wait a minute, how can you say that destruction of the brain allows for far greater consciousness? I would point out two very common clinical phenomena that we witness. One of these I mentioned in the book Proof of Heaven. It's called terminal lucidity. This occurs in patients with progressive dementia, and especially in this era of increasing prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of such patients. But the interesting thing is that when you spend time with such patients, what can often happen, has happened in the story that I presented in Proof of Heaven to a very good friend of mine. It was a friend who happened to be the chairman of one of the top neurosurgical training programs on earth, a very adept neuroscientist who I had a conversation with about 2.5 years after my coma. And I remember how absolutely shocked he was as I told my story. He looked at me with this incredulity because it helped him understand what had happened in his own experience. He had been with his father when his father was dying. His father had cancer, had a progressive dementia over about 2 years, had gotten to the point where for a few months he couldn't even say any intelligible words at all, seemed to be completely gone from this world. But as he came closer to physical death, he came back to life with my friend standing right there. And my friend for years afterward was blown away by this because he knew the reality of it. What he saw was his father came back to a point where he could talk with him, was very reflective, had perfect memory for events of his life, and not only that, he was talking with his own mother, the soul of his mother. And my friend was absolutely convinced of the reality of that encounter, even though my friend did not see who would have been his grandmother standing at the foot of the bed. But he could tell that his own father, who was there about to die, was having a very lively, pleasant, humorous reunion with the soul of his mother. In fact, that father had been with the mother when she had died during the Holocaust in a concentration camp. And he had been 14 years old at the time. And he had never discussed her with the family, with his son and others. And yet here he was having a beautiful reunion with her soul. And my friend was absolutely convinced of the reality of that. And yet he, as a conventional neuroscientist, had no idea how to make sense of it. And yet when I told him my story, all of a sudden everything started to click together. Now, terminal lucidity is something that's seen very commonly in those who deal with dying demented patients. And it's a beautiful example that completely counters the simplistic notion that the physical brain creates consciousness. There's no way to explain those kind of encounters except realizing that consciousness itself is fundamental and is not created by the brain at all. Now, the other set of clinical circumstances that are important to point out are the acquired savant syndromes, where people have some kind of head injury, or say a stroke, maybe autism, something like that, and it unmasks some superhuman mental capacity. Say the ability to calculate pi to 3,000 digits in the head, the ability to look at a phone book 1 page per second, and then you quiz someone minutes later and ask them what so-and-so's phone number is in one of the pages they just looked through, and they give you the phone number just like that. I had one patient, 19-year-old boy who was hit in the head with a baseball, had an epidural hematoma. Luckily, we got it out quickly. He had a beautiful recovery. But when he came back to see me to the second follow-up visit, he said, "Doc, I can do something I couldn't do before. Maybe you can explain it to me. Do you have a map?" I said, "Well, yes, I do." I pulled out a map, showed it to him. He looked at it for about 4 or 5 seconds. Then he put the map away. And then he started to draw from the center out a perfect version of that map. And he said, "I couldn't do that kind of thing before I was hit in the head with a baseball. What in the world happened?" I don't know. But that's exactly how this works. And I think that's going to be one of the greatest advantages of coming to realize that the physical brain is not the producer of consciousness, is as we study this more and more, the ability to uncover tremendous capacity and abilities in human kind of mental and conscious function that just really haven't existed in a robust and readily available form with our mindset today. But I think it's something that's coming. And so much of that has to do with going within. The infinite consciousness, that is the theme of this conference, and that is what I believe we all can have access to. It's by going within. And once you realize the physical brain is not the producer of consciousness, and that in fact we are conscious in spite of our brain, you can start to see how going into consciousness, especially into extraordinary states of transcendental consciousness, can allow us to know much more about the workings of this universe, of our relationship with it, and how we are really one, not only with each other and with this universe, but with the divine creative source itself, and with that pure sense of unconditional love that has infinite power to heal at all levels. And of course, that is the real power of near-death experiences, of spiritually transformative experiences. I would say that's really the origin of all of our great religious and spiritual beliefs over millennia, have been these kind of experiences. People seeing beyond the veil from whatever fashion, spontaneous epiphanies, severe physiologic or pathologic challenges to our system, like I had back in November 2008, what have you. These all open the door, but of course we can cultivate it. You don't have to die, or almost die, to know everything I know about those realms. But as a conscious being, going within is the way to do it. And that's how we get out into this universe. So how did I come to this kind of a transformation? Because I had spent my life wanting to believe what my father believed so readily, but in my years as an academic neurosurgeon, I found it harder and harder to understand how could conscious awareness continue after the death of the physical body and brain. That, to me, was a deep mystery. And of course, it had to do with the fact that I had no notion that the production model, brain producing consciousness, not a purely physical matter, was completely false. And some of the beautiful evidence for that, of course, is when you challenge any of those proponents of that supposition that the brain creates consciousness, and of course that means that our existence is birth to death and nothing more. When you challenge them to, okay, well fine, so brain produces consciousness, tell us more. You run into that absolute wall. Well, we just don't understand it yet, we need to study it more, we're getting closer. Well, what I would point out is some of the scientific work in recent years has helped very much to kind of flesh out that thinking. And it comes from a bit of an unusual direction. But along the same lines of what I said earlier, terminal lucidity, acquired savant syndromes, these are very strong evidence that consciousness is fundamental in the universe, that the brain only allows in consciousness in a limited fashion. Now, of course, my own personal journey was one where on November 10th of 2008, I woke at 4:30 in the morning with severe back pain, soon realized I had a horrific headache, and that's about the last thing I remember. I lapsed into coma at home, lying in bed. My family thought I was resting. They knew I was very ill at the time. And when they came back to check on me about 2 hours later, I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. Of course, I remember none of that. I remember none of the next 7 days. And in that setting, if you had asked me before my coma, you know, what would someone experience who had a severe gram-negative bacterial meningitis? It's the worst kind of meningitis you can have. Mine was very overwhelming because it drove me from symptom onset into coma within about 3.5 hours. And when you do a medical literature search, you'll find that if someone has that kind of gram-negative bacterial meningitis and goes into coma in anything less than 24 hours, they're already at a 10% chance of survival at best. So that was the rosy prognosis on Monday morning when I was first taken into the emergency room, was a 10% chance that I would live through this. And it only got worse. On the second day, my doctors got a report back from microbiology that the agent was E. coli. E. coli meningitis, spontaneous cases, only about 1 in 10 million per year or less in adults. In fact, it turns out that E. coli meningitis almost always happens in newborns. It's very rare beyond the age of 3 months. So yes, I do have to kind of defend my level of maturity in that setting, but that's a problem I have to live with. It turns out that during that week, things just got worse. By the 7th day of coma, it was a Sunday morning, the doctors called a family meeting, where they said, well, he's gone from about a 10% chance of survival down to a 2% chance. And if he's in that lucky 2%, what that really means is he'll spend a month or so in hospital, be transferred to a nursing home in a persistent vegetative state, and then die there a few months later. And that's why my doctors recommended just stopping the antibiotics, letting nature take its course. They'd had me on 3 very powerful antibiotics all week. I'd been on a ventilator in the medical ICU. With a very compromised brain function. And so that was their recommendation. And it was a few hours later that I started to come back to this world. Now my doctors were no fools, and they had consultants up and down the East Coast. They had consulted physicians at Mass General, at Harvard Medical School, at Duke, at University of Virginia, at Bowman Gray, and other medical centers, trying to somehow reverse this, what appeared to be an irreversible death spiral that I was on. Now, when I first started coming back to this world, my brain was absolutely savage. It was wrecked. I had no words or language at all. No memories of Eben Alexander's life before coma. Zero. None of my religious beliefs, none of my 20 plus years spent in the scientific world of academic neurosurgery. Every bit of it was completely wiped out. In fact, my mother, my sisters, my sons, standing at the bedside, I had no idea who these beings were. My brain was wrecked. But what I did know was where I had been, where I had just been, which seemed to be a journey that lasted for months or years, a very extraordinary odyssey. And that was burned into my knowing. And of course, that is part of the story that I tell in the book Proof of Heaven, that I talk about in many presentations, that involve a journey to many spiritual realms. And it's a journey that, if you buy into the production model, brain produces consciousness, is impossible, could not happen. And of course, that for me was the challenge. So when I first came back to this world, as I said, that's all I knew, was that extraordinary journey I had been on deep in coma. And I remembered nothing of Eben Alexander's life, not even the words or language that might be used to describe it. But all of that came back quickly. Words and language came back literally within hours, days. Childhood memories over a few weeks. All of my knowledge gained in more than 20 years in academic neurosurgery, everything about physics, chemistry, neuroscience, brain, mind, consciousness, returned over about 8 weeks or so. It was a fascinating thing to live through as all of this came back. Even more shocking is something that I came to realize in the years afterward through detailed recollection of certain conversations, both before and after my coma, that the memories that came back to me and were so complete by 8 weeks after coma were more complete than they had been before coma. People would often ask me in those early months, are you back at 90%? 95%? I say, well, gosh, it seems like I'm back at about 120%. And that's the kind of hard to understand truth. But it was this reboot of kind of coming back and having all that come back. Important to point out here that there is a myth out there in the world that goes along this whole production model, that somehow memories are stored in the brain. And if you get into looking at the neuroscience of memory, what you'll find is that is not at all clear. And in fact, no one is really able to define any place in the brain where memories are stored. Now, it turns out that there are structures in the brain that seem to be very deeply and intimately involved with the process of recording memories, of laying down memories. These are mainly in the medial temporal lobe, involving parts of the limbic system. And yet, that kind of holy grail of looking for where memories are stored in the brain has just been fraught with frustration by those who pursue it. There's a beautiful book from 1975 by Dr. Wilder Penfield, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of the 20th century, who worked in Montreal. And his career was mainly involved with working with epileptic patients and removing the part of their brain that was diseased, that was causing their seizures. And Dr. Penfield wrote a very powerful book in 1975 called The Mystery of the Mind. And in that book, he really summarized his experience as a hardcore neuroscientific investigator who had done most of his cases were patients that were operated on with weight. One interesting thing about the brain is that the brain feels no pain at all. So that you can do an operation where you do a very big craniotomy by anesthetizing local anesthesia in the scalp. And you can open the skull. I've done hundreds of those cases myself. They're fascinating. But once you get in and open up the dura overlying the brain, you can do all kinds of things with the patient wide awake. They feel no discomfort at all. And we do that in a setting where we're trying to resect something, especially near motor regions, the parts of the cortex devoted to movement, and also to speech. Those are very sacred grounds. So anytime something that's going to be resected is in the speech area, we do that, an operation with the patient awake. Dr. Penfield had performed many such cases. And in the late press, his work was known because of stories of electrical stimulation of the brain. And of course, what that led people to believe early on was the memories that he could trigger, the experiences, the emotional realities, and certain very kind of specific memories that might be quite ancient that he could bring up just by electrical stimulation of the cortical surface would lead one to believe simplistically that the memory is stored in that physical location. And yet what he came to realize over time is that was not the case at all. In fact, he had several cases in which he could document that a certain very specific memory was there from stimulation in a certain region, and even after he took that region out and it was all sent to pathology, the patient could still have the memory returned in perfect form. So the evidence was there that memory was not stored in the brain, and the more we've gone into trying to understand where memory is stored, the more we realize it's not stored in the brain at all. And this, of course, is part of the revelation that I've had to come to in my own understanding, is that experience itself, this model, this internal construct, as I told you, none of that is caused by any physical action going on in the brain. Or the consciousness itself. And this is where it gets fascinating. The collapse of the wave function, if you will, that kind of coalescence of actuality out of the cloud of all probabilities, is what we actually witness. Because our observing mind is doing that, is creating that cloud of actualities. And this is where, of course, the contribution from quantum physics is so extraordinary. And luckily we have a real expert in the room, Stuart Hameroff, who will be talking more about the real nuts and bolts of how this kind of thinking works. I think he and Roger Penrose have put forth one of the strongest kind of theories about how to relate brain, mind, and consciousness. It has to do with the microtubules and preservation of quantum information to the point where it can be used for computational purposes. Now, from my point of view, in my journey, the understanding of the quantum relationship goes far beyond just how does the brain work as a quantum computer. Because I've certainly gotten to the point early on, given that my whole neocortex was so handily devastated by this gram-negative bacterial meningitis, that's what would tell me as a conventional early 21st century neuroscientist that my experience could not have happened. It's impossible. And yet it did. That extraordinary spiritual journey, multiple layers, all the way out to the pure oneness, pure infinite love, that divine, so impossible to put it in any kind of human words. Every bit of that journey was much more real than this world. And of course, that was something that was big news to me because I'd never studied near-death experiences before. I didn't realize that more than half the people who describe them talk about how much more real that world is, which should come as no surprise when you realize that we are conscious in spite of our brain. Our brain is reducing, it's a reducing valve that limits conscious awareness. And that's why being able to get to the other side of that veil that I believe is provided by the neocortex can give us such incredible insight. And that's why this afternoon, Karen Newell will be sharing some of the differential sound frequency meditative techniques. Very briefly, I will just point out, to set the stage for the afternoon, is it has to do with a physiologic finding that was originally discovered by a German physiologist named Dove in the mid-1800s. And he found that by using slightly different frequencies to the two ears, that essentially you can generate very extraordinary states of consciousness. And the way it works is a little bit beyond anything I can put into a small, quick discussion here and now, but it has to do with the fact that the ignition system for consciousness in the lower brainstem is right next to a timing circuit that will take those two input sounds that are slightly different in frequency, measure their arrival time down to microseconds, and then you start to entrain that ignition system. You start to drive the modulating signals sent up from the lower brainstem to modulate consciousness to a point where what I believe is happening is you are actually taking the neocortex out of the equation, because you're basically causing it to oscillate in a very monotonous fashion. And that's what allows our conscious awareness to go free. And that was something that I discovered about 2 years after my coma, when I was first beginning to get into re-enter the world of meditation, which I had done a bit as a college student. Got into that mainly because I was trying to duplicate what had happened with my meningitis. I wanted to somehow recover that extraordinary ultra-reality of those spiritual realms, and found that I could do that in a very nice fashion using using these differential sound frequencies a la sacred acoustics. So that's something I would encourage people to join us this afternoon when we do that meditation here, and use those differential sound frequencies to go very deep indeed. And I've used them to go back into my coma experience. The only thing I must admit, I've never fully duplicated that full-blown hyper-reality that I experienced deep in coma. And it could be that I just have to wait until my brain and body are that far gone from being alive for my conscious awareness to fully come to knowing that again. So I think in a nutshell, what I see unfolding here is an awakening in humanity that has everything to do with the tip of the spear being the near-death experience, thanks to Raymond Moody, who will be up here in just a minute to talk about, as the father of that kind of burgeoning field, his view on it all. But from my point of view, that is no accident that physicians have come up with ways to resuscitate cardiac arrest patients over the last 50, 60 years, has populated this world with millions of souls who've been to the other side. And it's part of that awakening that I think is going to change this world. As I point out in my second book, The Map of Heaven, this is something that is very much part of what you would expect if you look over the last few thousand years of human history. That we're right where we ought to be. And I'm often accused of being very optimistic about the future, about this awakening. But I am very optimistic, because I believe that this world is shifting radically. And when people point out a lot of the darkness and evil, we don't have to look very far, very far back in time to see horrible examples of what humans do to each other. Out of this complete misunderstanding of the oneness and the connectedness of all, and how the fundamental driving principle at the core of this universe is one of love, of compassion, of forgiveness, acceptance, and mercy. And of course, this is something this conference is all about, is about that awakening. And so I think without taking up any more time, what I would like to do is thank you for your attention, and thank God we have Raymond Moody to come clarify this world for us now. So thank you all very much for having me. Thank you.